The Third Reich nears its end, and Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, seeks to mobilize his people like never before. In this critical scenario, the urgent need arises to form an additional force for the final defense of the Reich. The Volkssturm, also known as the People's Storm or People's Shock Troops, was a national militia formed by Nazi Germany in the final months of World War II. Unlike the German army, the Wehrmacht, this militia was not created by it, but by the National Socialist Party, under the orders of Adolf Hitler, being established on September 25, 1944. The new Volkssturm was inspired by the old Prussian Landsturm of 1813 to 1815, which fought in the wars of liberation against Napoleon, mainly as guerrilla forces. Plans to create a national militia named Landsturm in eastern Germany as a last resort to reinforce combat forces were proposed in 1944 by General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff. Facing a shortage of men in the army to resist the Soviet attack, other categories of men were called up, including those in non-essential jobs deemed unfit, older or underage, and those recovering from injuries. Although the theoretical existence of the Volkssturm dated back to around 1925, it only became a physical reality when Hitler ordered Martin Bormann to recruit 6 million men for the militia. Despite being formally established on September 25th, the Volkssturm was only announced to the public on October 16, 1944. The official launch occurred on October 18th, chosen by Heinrich Himmler to evoke historical events of resistance. Despite the appeal for this last-ditch effort, the planned force of 6 million members was never reached. The Volkssturm was a response to the Soviet threat, reflecting the desperate need for reinforcements. Messages of final victory broadcast by Nazi media during the creation of the Volkssturm served as a psychological support point for the civilian population. Although it had some marginal impact on morale, this was undermined by the obvious lack of uniforms and armaments among the recruits. Nazi themes such as death, transcendence, and celebration were exploited to encourage the fight. Many German civilians recognized this initiative as a desperate attempt to change the course of the war. Sarcastically, some older people remarked, "We, the old monkeys, are the Führer's newest weapon." A popular joke about the Volkssturm mocked, "Why is the Volkssturm Germany's most precious resource? Because its members have silver in their hair, gold in their mouths, and lead in their bones." For these militia units to be effective, they needed not only strength in numbers, but also fanaticism. During the early planning stages of the Volkssturm, it became clear that units lacking morale would not be effective in combat. Although nominally under party control, Volkssturm units were placed under Wehrmacht command when engaged in action. Aware that a people's army would not be capable of resisting the modern army assault carried out by the Allies, Hitler issued the following order at the end of 1944. Experience in the East has shown that the Volkssturm, emergency, and reserve units have little combat value when left to themselves and can be quickly destroyed. The combat value of these units, which are for the most part strong in number but weak in the armaments necessary for modern battle, is incomparably greater when they go into action with regular army troops in the field. I therefore order, where Volkssturm, emergency, and reserve units are available along with regular units in any battle sector, mixed battle groups, brigades, will be formed under unified command so as to give these units hardening and support. Generally, Volkssturm members received only basic military training, which included brief indoctrination and instruction in the use of elementary weapons, such as the Karabiner 98K rifle and the Panzerfaust. Due to constant combat and lack of weapons, weapons training was often minimal. The shortage of instructors led to World War I veterans being called upon to deliver weapons training. Many times, Volkssturm members only became familiar with their weapons during actual combat. The relentlessly fanatical members of the Volkssturm refused to abandon Nazi principles until the final days of the Nazi regime and, in some cases, carried out brutal police actions against German civilians deemed defeatist or cowardly. On certain occasions, Volkssturm members demonstrated exceptional courage and a determined will to resist, even surpassing Wehrmacht soldiers. Volkssturm Battalion 25/235, for example, began with 400 men, but fought until only 10 remained. Facing battle in Kustrin between January 30th and March 29th, 1945, militia units, predominantly composed of Volkssturm, resisted for nearly 2 months. Contrary to the idea of suicidal or apocalyptic perspectives, as the conflict neared its end, many members lost enthusiasm for the fight upon realizing the Allies' victory. This led them to lay down their arms and surrender, also motivated by fear of being captured by Allied forces and facing torture or execution as guerrillas. Officially, Volkssturm militias were supposed to serve only to defend their home localities, but as the situation in the Third Reich became more desperate, Nazi leaders sent militiamen directly to fight anywhere on the front where necessary, even removing them from their own bases. The armament to equip the Volkssturm came from various sources, including decommissioned Italian weapons, weapons captured on other fronts, and domestic and sporting weapons. The troops were not equipped with the standard rifles of the German army, Wehrmacht. Instead, they received grenade launchers, obsolete fake equipment considered outdated by the Wehrmacht, as well as more than 800,000 mortars, 200,000 light machine guns, 26,000 heavy machine guns, and 6,000 anti-aircraft cannons. However, much of this weaponry came from rebuilt material, usually dismantled to select reusable parts. In general, the effectiveness of these units in defending the Reich was very flawed due to the lack of preparation, poor dedication of the members, and shortage of adequate equipment. There were numerous cases of mass desertions or surrenders without fighting, especially when relocated to other fronts. In any case, they risked facing a military court or a firing squad. The widest use of the Volkssturm occurred during the Battle of Berlin, where its units fought in various parts of the city. In the Berlin area, the Volkssturm had around 60,000 members, divided into 92 battalions. Among them, approximately 30 battalions of Volkssturmfaust, equipped with some weapons, were sent to advanced positions, while the Volkssturm II battalions, unarmed, remained inside the city. However, the Soviet force, composed of more than 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and over 40,000 artillery pieces, was assigned to capture the city, and the weakened remnants of the Wehrmacht were no match for it. Faced with the prospect of a death considered meaningless, many older members of the Volkssturm sought hiding places to avoid the advance of the Soviet army. This contrasted with the tragic image of Berlin resisting against all odds, while Wehrmacht soldiers and Volkssturm members frequently surrendered and retreated in southern and western Germany. Despite efforts, the last 4 months of the war represented an exercise in futility for the Volkssturm. The Nazi leadership's insistence on continuing the fight to the end resulted in approximately 1.23 million more deaths, half of them German military, and the other half from the Volkssturm. In many small towns, when Volkssturm leaders refused to face the superior forces of the Allies in an attempt to avoid the total destruction of their home regions, they were tried and summarily hanged by party activists. As one historian put it, wars were all-or-nothing affairs. For the Nazis, negotiation equated to weakness and surrender. In this sense, Hitler, Bormann, and Goebbels were far more Nazi than both Himmler and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who by the end of 1945 wanted to negotiate with the enemy. Thus, especially after the failure of the assassination attempt on July 20th, when, in their eyes, the traitors were unmasked, the Nazis wanted to renew, not end, the fight. It is significant to note that more people in Europe died after July 20th, 1944, than in all 5 previous years of war. For the Nazis, the Volkssturm was both a valid and rational response to the events of 1944 to 1945, just as the emergence of the party itself had been to the fall of Imperial Germany in 1918 to 1920. In fact, if anyone's morale were to collapse, it would be that of the Allies, not that of the German people led by the Nazi Party under Hitler. In the spring of 1945, Himmler ceased to be a real factor in the power struggles of the Volkssturm and was replaced in those battles by Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, who was working closely with the German armed forces, mainly the regular army, to prevent the scorched earth policies decreed by the Führer, aimed at turning the Third Reich into an industrial wasteland useless to any conquering army. Speer, unlike the rigid leaders Himmler and Göring, did not fit the stereotype of a Nazi in the style of Hitler, Goebbels, and Bormann. He envisioned for himself a role as the rebuilder of the Fourth Reich, at least with the acceptance of the Western Allies. In the end, however, Bormann's concept of the Volkssturm was undone by the very people he most wanted to protect and from whom he expected the least danger, the officers and men of the German army, into whose sphere of operations the individual VS units were inserted. The main reason for this was that the party simply could not, and did not, supply the VS with the weapons, uniforms, and supplies it needed, whereas the regular army generally did. Wherever the VS and the army worked well together, morale was good, absenteeism decreased, discipline was maintained, and training was intensified. Thus, to his dismay, Bormann found himself faced with a situation in which the army delivered where the party had failed. The reason for this was also that, unlike the upper ranks of the officer corps, who were largely monarchists in belief and origin, the lower-ranking officers and most soldiers were Nazis to the core. For them, the attempt to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944, was a disgrace to the good name of Germany. In fact, the army was closely involved with the Volkssturm from the beginning. It was the army that supplied both the Panzerfaust, a shoulder-launched rocket similar to the US bazooka, and the anti-tank weapons Panzerschreck, tank terror, that stopped many enemy tanks in their tracks. In the end, the Panzerfausts were the only weapons available in abundance to the VS in combat. One fear shared by all VS members was that, without uniforms, they would simply be executed by the enemy for being partisans or terrorists behind enemy lines, especially if confused with the proposed post-war werewolf organization of Dr. Ley. They also disliked the Brown Party uniforms, fearing that Red Army troops would be more inclined to kill them and refuse to capture them. Some even served in civilian clothes, overcoats, and hats, with only a Volkssturm armband and a paybook to officially identify them as members of the Volkssturm. Negotiations were conducted with the Western Allies to recognize the VS as legitimate combatants, and these were successful, but not significantly, with the Soviets. In the operations in the East, Volkssturm formations were at Guderian's disposal, again, ironically, and here they performed well, even managing to halt the advance of the Red Army in Gumbinnen, East Prussia, in late 1944 and elsewhere. However, in the West, they gave up in places like Remagen upon realizing the retreat of the German army. The casualty rates in the Volkssturm were sometimes as high as 70 to 80%, while other units panicked and fled. In the East, about 650,000 men from the Volkssturm went into action. But when Nazi Party officials fled in the face of the Red Army's advance, the Volkssturm fled as well. When the army left the Volkssturm as rear units, unsurprisingly, they returned home instead of dying in that manner. In the West, about 150,000 men of the Volkssturm served and helped to man the fortifications of the Siegfried Line, as well as to defend the Upper Rhine. But in the end, the Volkssturm did not achieve the goal of Himmler or Bormann. It is estimated that 1 million Volkssturm troops were taken prisoner by the end of the war, and thousands of others were killed and wounded. It is true that the Volkssturm was a legal militia, not partisan guerrillas, but the Nazis were simply mistaken both about the motivation and willingness to fight to the bitter end of their people's militia, and about the moral outrage of their enemies and the determination to totally defeat the Third Reich, no matter how long it took or at what cost. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.